Hi, everyone. This is Mike Gormley. It's the Mike Gormley Show. I have a very interesting guest today, exceptional guitarist, and his name is Laurence Juber, or is it LJ? I hear that may be how we refer to you.
Well, it's either. And the reason for LJ really came about because people started referring to me as Larry.
Oh,
And nobody ever called me Larry when I was growing up. It's not really that common in England,
uh,
unless, of course, your actual birth name is Larry. And so I never knew who Larry was. And eventually, some friends of mine started calling me LJ, and that was what stuck. So, but Lawrence is fine.
oh, right. That's great. I hadn't heard that before today. Um, anybody listening, Lawrence is very busy. There's a ton of albums out. There's a new one just out with a single. A Day in My Life is the album, and the single is Blackbird. Um, but its highest profile was that of a guitarist in the band Wings, which a lot of people know that Paul McCartney's band as Wings and don't necessarily know the Beatles. So it was a huge very successful band. Um, can you tell you weren't at the beginning of Wings, you came in a little later on. Can you tell us how all of that came about?
Sure. Um, I was a studio musician in London. That was always my ambition as a teenager, was to be a studio musician. And I was I had been doing a lot of work. I was in that era. You could work 7 days a week, doing 3 or 4 sessions a day. I mean, it was mid 70s. It was still the era before computers and home studios, and I was a busy player, and I was playing lead guitar on a TV show with David Essex, who was a big pop star at the time.
Mhm.
And Denny Lane from Wings was a musical guest on the show. We did the song Go Now, which was the hit that he had with the Moody Blues, which kind of was his signature song. And he liked my playing and recommended me to Paul and Linda. That's kind of the short version of the story.
Mhm.
Um, and in April of 78, I went and did an audition, not really knowing any Wings tunes, but as it turned out, we jammed on some Chuck Berry songs and some reggae grooves, and I was offered the job. I think I fit the suit, to be honest.
You think what? Sorry, I didn't hear
Fit
that.
the suit.
Ah, okay.
Um, and from there, I spent 3 years in the band, and it was a great education. I got my bachelor's degree from London University and my master's degree from McCartney,
Uh,
functionally. I learned about making records. I learned what it meant to be in a successful band, and all the machinery behind it, the way that the record business worked. Because my prior experience, really, as a studio player, was behind a music stand predominantly. I mean, it's just playing from the music or contributing to arrangements in the studio, and it was a great way to be making a living. But it was really working with McCartney that kind of unlocked the artistic side of me
mhm.
and made me understand what it meant to be an artist and how I could find my own path with that.
How long was it from, let's say, the audition to there you were on stage? How long did that process take?
That actually took some time because we made an album before we ever performed live as a band. And the album took some time also. So um, although we did some performances, but they were just kind of in a private um, situation, like when we were filming videos and playing for the crew and everybody else. But the touring happened sometime later.
Which album was that? Your first Wings
The
album?
Back to the Egg album, which was the
Uh,
final Wings album, which is actually credited simply to Wings, not to Paul McCartney and Wings, because Paul really encouraged us to believe it as, to contribute to it as a band, as opposed to being his backup musicians, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Um, that's interesting because, he's one of the most famous people on earth, but he sees it as a band. He didn't see it as a backup to him, which
Yeah.
had
Uh,
to give a nice flavor to the whole thing.
well, and that was also the period then because, it was very much, Wings was very much Paul's intention to work with Linda.
Hmm.
So, Linda was very integral to it, as was Denny. I mean, it was really, um, it was a collaborative effort, even though Paul's, credited with the vast majority of the songwriting. It's still, there was something collaborative about it, and there was a lot of freedom. I found a lot of freedom to be able to contribute my own, conceptually contribute my own ideas in terms of the way the guitar solos would go, the way that I was able to bring my texture and sound into the picture.
Well, so you're somebody who heard, I think it was I Want to Hold Your Hand at age 13 or something like that.
11, yeah.
11.
But it was actually a little earlier than that because really in August of 1963, She Loves You was released, which was the fourth Beatles single. And that was the one that was really, when Beatlemania was really starting to ramp up at that point.
Hmm.
Um, and although I'd been hearing the Beatles on the radio consistently all through that year, um, but August, on school holidays, and um, it just made a big impression. And I was really desperate to learn to play guitar. And my dad wanted me to play the saxophone because he was a big band fan. And so I kind of begrudgingly agreed to learn clarinet in high school because I was just moving into a new school. And but I made sure that my name was at the bottom of the list. So they ran out of clarinets long before they got to me. And then a week before my 11th birthday was when the Beatles performed for royalty on the Royal Command performance in London. And I think that kind of was the point of transition from the guitar being a hooligan instrument to something that actually had some legitimacy. And for my 11th birthday, there was a guitar at the end of the bed, and 60 years later, I still have yet to put it down.
Um, Parents have a way of doing that. I absolutely loved drums. I would follow parades around the city, walking along beside the drummer. I absolutely loved drums. So they got me into piano lessons. I
Yeah.
I still haven't figured that one out. So but you rejected the saxophone and did what you wanted to do. But
Yeah, I did.
I
Yeah.
find it interesting that all of that was going on when you were 11, but you were by 13. Were you recording, or I'm not sure what happened, but you were playing guitar.
Yeah, I was actually making some money playing guitar because a local band leader had kind of adopted me musically and started taking me out on gigs. So I was learning on the bandstand, and I could read a little bit of music, so I could find my way through some sheet music, and just really on the bandstand learning how to use my ears. And that really continued, throughout my teenage years as playing in top 40 bands, but always intending to continue to study music, especially because my parents both had left school, my dad at 14, my mom at 15. Growing up in London during World War II, it was
Uh,
difficult for them, and I had the opportunity to have a proper education. And so even though I was offered opportunities to become a professional in my mid-teens, I really decided I was going to stick with education as long as that education was based on music,
yeah,
which it was.
which you and pretty solid education in it, in masters and so on. You went to the top.
Well, I just, what was really important to me was understanding style. Because as a studio musician, you really have to cover a lot of different styles. So you have to be versatile. And I uh, studied, at London University. My major was musicology. I mean, music and musicology. So, I studied the theory side of it, but I also studied the history side of it so that I could really have a context for what I was doing, especially because my personal kind of musical tastes were very eclectic. I
Hmm.
was a big fan of fingerstyle guitar players, and especially 1963, as well as being kind of Beatlemania emerging. So it was Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and then Donovan, and a lot of kind of finger picking guitar was just kind of built into that musical style. And I got fascinated by that and by ragtime. I became a fan of what became known as the folk baroque in England, represented by Pentangle, Bert Jansch, John Remborn.
Oh, yeah, wonderful.
And then, but I was also, kind of a rock blues lead guitar player with, slowing down Eric Clapton solos and Hendrix. And, when you'd take the LP and you'd slow it down to 16 RPM and you'd kind of pretty much be half speed at that point.
But even at that speed, Hendrix must have been kind of difficult to figure out.
Well, I think the difficulty with Hendrix really was just understanding what was going on sonically because he was such a kind of a proto-synthesist using an electric guitar almost like a synthesizer,
Yeah.
using fuzz boxes and as oscillators and wah-wah pedals as filters and all the stuff that kind of became more kind of programmable and keyboard driven, once MIDI came into effect in the 80s. But for me, it was the tougher part was really dealing with the jazz guitar players. I would
Mm.
listening to Barney Kessel and Howard Roberts and people, players of that nature, Joe Pass, and really starting to understand that kind of nexus of the guitar and advanced jazz harmony and melody. But at the same time, being able to also just kind of dig in and play a blues solo. So all of that was just really kind of germane to the idea that I could be a versatile studio musician.
Uh-huh.
That came to fruition after I graduated, and I had been playing with the National Youth Jazz Orchestra in England, and that was a big band and something of a farm team for the studio world. And I got a call from a contractor who'd seen me on a television broadcast with the big band and offered me some studio work. Ironically, the first sessions he offered me I couldn't do because it was the days of my final exams at university. So I didn't think I'd hear from him again. But a week later, he called back with more dates, and then it just snowballed from there. And that kept me going, through really through about a 3-year period, including playing on the James Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me. That was one of the highlights of that particular period. And then certain things that I didn't even know I had played on for or had been successful for some years. I played on the Alan Parsons Project first album, Tales of Mystery and Imagination.
Mm.
I played on a number of records with Charles Aznavour, who's a great French Armenian, kind of an heir to the Edith Piaf throne,
Sure.
almost, and a lot of stuff with very, and to this day I've worked with great songwriters and very highly respected kind of mainstream artists, whether it's people like Paul Williams or back in the day. I mean, I did an album with Rosemary Clooney in 1976. Yeah.
Oh,
Which was great experience for me,
yeah.
because it's so different from making a rock and roll record, but it's all music and
I,
it's all part of the experience.
we were recently talking to John Hernandez, Johnny Batos, the
Mhm.
drummer for Oingo Boingo.
Sure, and I've worked with him too.
Ah, well, and he before Oingo Boingo was touring with Helen Reddy.
Hmm.
So you never know where one thing's going to lead to.
Yeah. No, in fact, I worked with him on. Um, well, I've done sessions over the years for Danny Elfman and also for Steve Bartek, and so I remember one session with him with. I think it was the bass player from Oingo Boingo too. So
Yeah, John Avila.
yeah. So
Uh,
yeah, you find yourself in the studio with, you never know who it's going to be.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm wondering, even pre-Beatles, which takes you to pretty young, but there was a guitar-driven band in England called the Shadows.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that had to have an effect on you, right?
Yeah, because, you know, Apache, which was their first big hit, I mean, that was, you know, what, 59, I think. So I was
Something like that.
7 years old. I mean, that made a big impression. And that was really the beginning of falling in love with the sound of the guitar. Um, but the exciting thing for me was in October of 1978, Wings did a recording session at Abbey Road where Paul had this idea about recording a rock orchestra. And he called it Rockestra. And the guitar section was Pete Townsend, Dave Gilmour, Denny Lane, Hank Marvin, and myself.
Really?
So I'm standing next to Hank Marvin, you know, and not to mention my other, you know, teenage guitar heroes. So, yeah, a great joy in that
That,
circumstance. You know.
I can imagine that would be. I was starting to play myself around that time, and it was Shadow stuff. It was in Canada. It wasn't in the
Yeah.
States. It was Shadow stuff, and then not long after the Beatles came in, so the Shadows got left behind, unfortunately.
But you know, ironically, I mean, I think the first recorded original composition by Beatles
Uh-huh.
was a John Lennon, George Harrison instrumental called "Cry for a Shadow."
Yeah, 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 exactly.
And that was, you know, inspired by the Shadows.
Very, very interesting times.
Yes.
Um, what now? Of course, we'll talk about Wings a little more and so on. But you've won a couple of Grammys on your own.
Well,
Um,
the first Grammy was with Wings. It was for
uh,
that orchestra recording that I mentioned, because that was the first Grammy in the rock instrumental category.
uh-huh,
And then the second Grammy came about because I was asked to contribute to an album of solo guitar arrangements of tunes by Henry Mancini. And the lead-off track on the album was the Pink Panther, my solo arrangement of the Pink Panther. And somehow I managed to pull off an arrangement like that, because it was not an easy thing to do, but I
no.
managed to pull it off. And that won a Grammy in the pop instrumental category.
Were you living in LA by then?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
moved to LA in 1981.
I see.
Fairly quickly got back into doing studio work because I got married. We started raising a family, and I didn't really want to be traveling. And that started a whole new chapter for me, both as a studio musician and then a little bit later as a soloist too.
Very interesting. We're going to have to go to a commercial in a very short time. And we're going to throughout the show be playing music from your new album. Maybe not the entire tune, maybe, just on the
Uh-huh.
way out and on the way back in. Uh,
Yeah, you have some not only from the album, but you also have some of my original instrumentals
right.
played too. So
Which I've been listening to are beautiful, beautifully
thank
done.
you, thank you.
So we'll be back in a short while and talk more to Laurence Juber. And this is Mike Gormley. It is the Mike Gormley Show, and we'll see you in a little while.